Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm super excited to dive into the history of the Norse seafarers, the Vikings, guys. Let's check out this video.
Welcome back to another video. Today we're gonna take a look on who the Vikings were. The Vikings were the people who lived from the 8th century to the 11th century in Scandinavia, and they came from what today is Denmark, Norway and Sweden. And during the Viking Age they sailed around most of Europe, raiding, trading and spreading their influence. And especially raiding, trading and searching for new and fertile land to settle on was probably the three most important reasons they had before they decided to jump into one of their longships and set sail. The Vikings loved to sail and explore so much that they would eventually discover new lands such as the Faroe Islands, Iceland and Greenland. They would in fact even sail so far west as to the coast of Canada, at the place what today is known as Newfoundland. When the Vikings were not sailing around and searching for new and fertile land, they loved to trade. And the Vikings traded with all sorts of things, such as jewelry, tools and fur. But it was probably slaves that were one of their best-selling goods. The Vikings did not speak Danish, Norwegian or Swedish. They spoke a language which is called Old Norse. And because the fact that the Vikings loved to travel and meet new people, their language slowly spread into other societies. In fact, Old Norse was one of the most spoken languages across Europe in the 10th century. The language could be heard from Vinland in North America to Volga in Russia. Old Norse had a major influence on other languages as well, and languages such as English and Russian still has words today that originate from the Viking language. However, there was of course different dialects. The Danes and the Swedes spoke Old East Norse, and the Norwegians spoke Old West Norse. Today, nobody in Scandinavia speak Old Norse. Each country have their own language. However, most people can understand each other. For instance, a Dane can understand what a Norwegian is saying, and a Norwegian can understand what a Swede is saying. The Icelandic language is the closest of the Scandinavian languages to Old Norse, and that is probably because they have been so isolated in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean. So if a Viking somehow time travels into our time, it will probably only be the Icelandic people who would be able to understand what he or she says. Unlike most of the other countries in Western Europe who used the Latin alphabet, the Vikings had their own alphabet that consisted of runic letters called the Younger Thurak, which is something we know because there's been found many runestones throughout Scandinavia from this time period. The inscriptions on these runestones are all in runic, and these ancient inscriptions describes everything from honoring their ancestors to bragging about their personal achievements.
Wow.
At this time in history, Christianity was spreading rapidly throughout Western Europe by the edge of a sword. However, it had not quite made its way to Scandinavia. The Vikings were still heathens, and they had their own religion. Unfortunately, we do not know what they called their religion, or if it even had a name at all. The Vikings believed in many gods and goddesses, something that is called polytheism, and you might have heard the names of some of their gods before. There is, for instance, Odin, who is the All-Father and the chief of the Aesir, and Thor, who's the god of thunder, and Freya, who's the goddess of fertility. The Viking faith would not last.
So all these gods were the gods of Vikings Wow, interesting.
And the Vikings would eventually slowly convert into Christianity from around the 10th century, which is something we know because it could be read on the yelling stone that was raised by the King of Denmark, Harald Bluetooth, or as he is called in Danish, Harald Blåtand. King Harald ordered this monument made in memory of Gorm, his father, and in memory of Thyra, his mother, that Harald, who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian.
Wow.
There is a misconception about how fast the Vikings were Christianized, because they did not, as some people think, shift from believing in the old gods to Christianity from one moment to another. In reality, it took the church centuries to convert the Scandinavians into this foreign Abrahamic religion. Of course, this is something that the church would never admit to, but we do know that it is a fact. Because of the many archaeological findings from this time period, some Vikings would simply not let go of their god Thor, and they would refuse to wear any cross around their neck. There were, of course, also those who were standing with one foot in both camps, where they, on one side, were still praying to their old gods, and on the other side, attending to the ceremonies in the local church. These people walked around with a special piece of jewelry, which had both the symbol for the god Thor, which was the hammer Mjolnir, and the symbol for Christianity, which is the cross, in the same piece of jewelry.
Wow, they were serving two masters, so to speak, right? Funny.
But of course, some people would just wear one of each. A typical Viking was much more than just someone who went on raids for riches, fame and women. There was, of course, some Vikings who did nothing else than to fight and serve their local jarl or king. But that was more the exception than it was the norm. Most of the Vikings were actually just ordinary people who minded their own business and spent their days with taking care of their family and farm. As I have talked about before, the Viking society was split into 4 social classes, which consisted of slaves, carls, jarls and royals. Within this social hierarchy, the majority of the Vikings were part of the social class called carls, which were the working class within their society. These people had ordinary jobs, such as farmers, fishermen, smiths and merchants. But the overwhelming majority of them were farmers. In fact, it is estimated that 90% of the society in Scandinavia were farmers in the Viking Age. This meant that the typical farmer did not have the time nor the necessary fighting experience to participate in these raids. And taking part in these raids were also very time consuming, because raids would often last many months and in some cases even years. Most of the people within this society would most likely have stayed at home their whole life, and some of them may never have left the local area. While it was mostly the farmers who went on these raids, it was the jarls who paid for the expedition and provided the ships to sail across the sea. The jarls were what we today would call the upper class, and they had many more resources at their disposal than a typical farmer had. This also meant that they had some of the best fighting equipment available, and some of them even had a sword, which was a very rare weapon at this time in history. The farmers and the other carls who would go on these raids could only dream about getting their hands on a weapon like a sword, and they had to be satisfied with their own common weapons such as axes, spears and shields. Many people have heard about these Viking raids before, but these raids in Scandinavia was not something new at this time in history. It had taken place for hundreds of years. However, it was the advancement in technology that led to new opportunities, and there can really be no doubt about it, that it was the advancement in seafaring technology that laid the foundation for what today is known as the Viking phenomenon.
Wow, I didn't know the Viking raids were so widespread. Wow, these stories are really interesting and captivating. Wow.
It was the development of a new ship type, the Viking ship, that made it possible for the expansion of the Scandinavian civilization into literally all directions. This new ship type made it possible to sail faster and further away from their homeland in a very short amount of time. Without the Viking ship, there would probably not have been any Vikings, and therefore no Viking Age, and the map of Europe might have looked much different today. As I said earlier, the beginning of the Viking Age is considered to be from the 8th century, or to be more precise, it started on June 8, 793, when the Vikings attacked the monastery on the holy island of Lindisfarne. This raid has been described by the monks to have been a very devastating attack that not only shocked the church, but sent shockwaves throughout Western Europe, all the way down to the Pope in Rome. The Vikings were merciless, and not only did they plunder all the riches from the monastery, they also killed most of the monks. Lo, it has been nearly 350 years that we and our fathers have inhabited this most lovely land, and never before has such terror appeared in Britain, as we have now suffered from a pagan race, nor was it thought that such an inroad from the sea could be made. Behold, the church of St. Cuthbert, splattered with the blood of the priest of the god, despoiled of all its ornaments, a place more venerable than in all Britain, is given as a prey to the pagan peoples. Just like the Viking Age was born in blood on the British Isles, it will also end in the same way. And only 273 years after the attack on the monastery of Lindisfarne, there were two huge and important battles that would decide the fate of the British people.
Wow.
The first major battle took place on the 25th of September in 1066 at Stamford Bridge, when Harald Hardrada, who was the king of Norway, had gathered an enormous army of somewhere between 7,000 to 9,000 men, who had crossed the sea from Scandinavia on 300 huge Viking ships. However, the English outsmarted the Vikings, and Harald was killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. While Harald laid on the ground, coughing up blood, his army defended him to the very last man. Harald's army, that had been split into two earlier, suffered a crushing defeat, and because of their loyalty to their king, they were almost totally wiped out by the English army. Later the same year, the descendants of the Vikings, who had settled in Normandy in northern Francia, which is northern France, crossed the English Channel and attacked and defeated the English army on the 14th of October at the Battle of Hastings. The Normans completely wiped out the English army and conquered all of England. The Battle of Hastings is when, according to the historians, marks the end of the Viking Age. However, it could be argued that the Viking Age went beyond this date, but the raids did almost come to a complete halt after these two huge battles. It should also be said that while the Viking Age is said to have started in 793, the date could also be pushed further back, because the people from Scandinavia had in decades prior to the attack at Lindisfarne raided both the shores in Scandinavia and the areas around the Baltic Sea. The reason why we know so much about the Vikings today is because of a combination of the archaeological findings throughout Northern Europe and the many written sources. Although we should bear in mind that most of the sources have been written down by other societies. The Vikings did not write down their own history on paper, or at least there hasn't been found any evidence so far. So unless we want to scratch our knowledge together about them by just looking at the runestones, We have to use sources written down by either the monks or the Islamic travelers. The Viking Age had a huge impact on how the countries in Scandinavia would take shape. And according to the Yellingstone that I mentioned before, it was Harald Bluetooth who united the Danes into one country called Denmark. And according to the sagas, it was Harald 𝐋𝐈𝐊𝐄 who united the Norwegians into one country called Norway. The Swedes, being the typical Swede, would not become a unified country before many hundreds of years after the Viking Age. But the territories in Scandinavia was more or less defined during this time in history. I hope you liked the video, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up. See you next time for another video. Thank you for watching.
Wow, what an interesting video. Wow. Definitely the impact of the Vikings on modern society is undeniable, right? They did a lot. What? Wow. This was an interesting watch, even though the video was long, but then it was interesting and educational. I hope you learned one or two from the video because I did. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in my next video. Bye.